What do children need to know about language in order to be able to read? How does this knowledge develop? Do special experiences, like bilingualism, change the way that development occurs? Children begin learning about reading from the time someone reads them their first story, and they continue learning a lot about the forms and functions of reading throughout the next several years. By the time they're about 4 years old, most children can recite the alphabet, identify letters and tell you what sounds they make, print their names, and know the difference between things that can be read and things that can't be read. But these children are still, on average, about 2 years away from reading on their own. On the face of it, it's a bit puzzling. If a child can tell you that the letter D says duh, and so on for O and G, why can't they tell you that D-O-G says dog? The reason they can't is because these forms have to be understood as symbols, and that's very difficult for children to do. Children are learning a lot about symbols at this age, but what they're learning about is first-order representation. In this case, a form directly stands for a meaning. The word dog stands for the object, the animal dog. This occurs a lot in their activities during these early years as they engage in symbolic play. Any object around the playroom can stand for anything they need. A broom can be a horse, a box can be a house, and so on. Children's early drawings are like this as well. Any squiggle on the page can represent any object the child likes. But reading requires second-order representation. A symbol stands for some other symbol, and that symbol determines the meaning. The letters D-O-G stand for the word dog, and that stands for the animal. Second-order symbolic representation is very difficult, and it's the first time children have encountered it. So what children need to do in order to read is to learn how these letters, these forms that they've been practicing, have to become symbols in a second-order representation. The research question we began with was to look at how children come to understand this in the stages just before the time they're reading on their own. What is the difference between knowing the notations, the letters, as a formal system and knowing how they function as symbols? How does this knowledge develop? These are the research questions we asked in the studies I'm going to describe. The model that the studies are based on takes 3 different stages that children pass through as they learn about these written forms. In the first stage, called conceptual representation, the forms are learned as whole patterns, whole routines. Children can recite the alphabet, but if you stop them in the middle, they have to go back to the beginning to start again. It's an unbroken sequence. At some point, they learn about the individual units in the alphabet. They learn about the letters. This is the stage of formal representation, and this is the stage children are at when they can do those things I described earlier, identify letters, tell you what letter their name starts with, and so on. But reading requires stage 3. It requires symbolic representation. Children have to go one step further. They have to see that these forms are part of a long series of relationships, which eventually lead to meanings. We examined the way children come to understand these representations by looking at 3 groups of children who were pre-readers. Some of the children in the study were monolingual speakers of English. Another group were French-English bilingual children. And a third group was Chinese-English bilingual children. All of the children were 4 or 5 years old, and all of them were screened to make sure they were in stage 2, that they knew about the formal systems. The bilingual children were experienced in both writing systems. The bilingual children had been read stories in both languages and knew the forms in both languages. So in the screening tasks, where we assured that they were at stage 2, this was carried out in both languages for the bilingual children. The screening tasks were tests of reciting the alphabet and identifying printed forms to make sure that indeed these children were at that stage. All of the children were then given 2 different tasks, and the bilingual children got all of the tasks, all of the materials in both languages. Everything was repeated for the bilingual children in both languages. We asked the children to solve 2 tasks. The first task we call the moving word task, and the purpose was to see if children understand what the printed form means, what its function is. The second task, called the word size task, asked more detailed questions about how the child believes the printed word says what it does. In the moving word task, children are shown 2 pictures. In this example, there's a picture of a king and a picture of a goat. And the experimenter talks about the pictures with the child and names them. Then the experimenter brings out a card that has one of the words printed on it and tells the child, this is the word king. This card says king, and puts it down under the picture of the king. Then the experimenter asks the child, can you tell me what this card says? At that point, there's a terrible ruckus on the table because 2 stuffed animals that were sitting there start a fight. And as they're chasing each other around the table, the card accidentally gets kicked. So now it's under the picture of the goat. Now the experimenter says to the child for the second time, can you tell me what word is printed on this card? What does this card say? After the child's answer, the experimenter says, let's put things back the way they were before that fight started. And the card is returned to its original position. And now the experimenter asks for a third time, can you tell me what this card says? If children understand that written forms are symbols, then they'll know that that word always says the same thing. Wherever it is, it's the letters that tell you what the card says. But if children don't see the letters as symbols, if they're just some sort of object, then the meaning of the word depends on other things. If we look at the results, we can see how the children answered the question when the card was under the wrong picture. This is the inconsistent question, where the word king is under the picture of the goat. What's the proportion of times children give the correct answer, king, when the picture is under the goat? The 2 top lines with the square and the triangle show you the percentage correct by the 2 groups of bilingual children. And you can see they're almost exactly the same as each other. The bottom line with the circles is the performance of the monolingual children. These children had a great deal of trouble with this problem. And even when they were 5 years old, they were not solving it as well as the 4-year-old bilingual children. In this case, the monolingual children had trouble understanding that it was the print itself that told you what the word said. Somehow the experience the bilingual children had in seeing things printed in 2 different ways helped them to understand that it's the print that tells the story. The second task asked for much more detailed knowledge about how print tells you what it means. In an alphabetic language, long words need more letters. Every letter represents a sound, and so a word with many sounds needs many letters. We examined whether or not children understood this by showing them again pictures and then asking them about how the names could be written. In this example, we show the child a picture of an elephant and a picture of an ant, and then give them two words. And we say, one word says elephant and the other card says ant. Can you figure out which card has each word on it and put it under the picture it goes with? The way to solve the problem is to attach the longer word with the card that has more letters. In this case, elephant with the longer word. But on half of the questions, the big word, banana, happens to name a small thing compared to the small word. So in the inconsistent question, children had to solve the problem without paying any attention to what these things mean. In this case, they had to attach the big word banana to the small item and the small word car to the big item. And you can only do that if you pay attention to the sounds. Since all of the materials were translated for the bilingual children, a problem arose how to adapt this task to Chinese. Because Chinese is not an alphabetic language, we chose these children to investigate whether experience with non-alphabetic scripts made any difference. But the problem was in how to create materials that could examine the issue in Chinese. What we decided to use was number of strokes. So just as English words can have many letters or few letters, Chinese characters can have many strokes or few strokes. And these characters can represent big objects like elephant or little objects like mouse, mouth, in a consistent example, or big objects like mountain with few strokes and small objects like candy with many strokes. How did children solve this problem? The experience that the two groups of bilingual children had here was very different from each other. The French-English bilingual children had been read stories and learned the forms of writing that were in two different languages, but using exactly the same forms. In that sense, they have two languages but one writing system. The Chinese English bilingual children were learning two different languages as well as two different writing systems. So they're bilingual and biliterate. If we look at the results, we can see again that there's a difference, but the division is in a different place. The two groups performing exactly the same as each other are the monolingual children and the French-English bilingual children. The Chinese English bilingual children are different. The 4-year-olds are at a much lower level of performance than all of the other children. They have a lot of trouble with this task, and they're very confused about how to solve the problem in both languages. By 5 years old, they not only make up the lost ground, they surpass the other children. And the difference between the Chinese English bilingual children and the others at 5 years old is significant. So what the Chinese children have learned in their experience is how to sort out the rules for two completely different writing systems. At the beginning, it was very confusing, and it in fact decreased their performance relative to other children of the same age. A year later, they had not only solved the problem, they had solved it better than children without that experience. Another aspect of learning to read is being able to pay attention to the sound system. As we've seen with the word size task, being able to look at the sounds of the word is an important part of reading. Many researchers have already documented that children's phonological awareness, their awareness of the sounds of language, is one of the important predictors for learning to read. We were interested in how differences in phonological awareness might help children at the time they're learning how to read in the early stages, and to see whether or not bilingualism made any difference in that development. We developed a study in which we looked at two groups of children. Half of them were monolingual speakers of English, and half of them were bilingual speakers of French and English. And again, you'll see here that the bilingual children are using an alphabetic script with only one writing system. The children were 5, 6, and 7 years old. The 5-year-olds are just pre-readers. The 6-year-olds have been studying reading for a few months in first grade, and the 7-year-olds have been reading for a year. They're in second grade. We gave all of these children a difficult test of phonological awareness. The test looked like this. Children were asked a question about word pairs. Take away the first sound in cat and put in the first sound in mop. What word do you have? This is very difficult because they need to segment the first sound in the target word. They need to segment the first sound in the second word, and then manipulate these sounds to create a new word, a third word. In this case, mat. Many steps are involved, and a great deal of attention is required to keep track of these processes, just like in reading. If we look at the results, you can see that the ability to do this was very different for the monolingual and the bilingual children up until the time they were reading. For the 5- and 6-year-olds, the bilingual children, shown with the triangles, were performing at a significantly higher level than the monolingual children. By 7 years old, when they're all reading, the differences disappeared. You can see as well that although the monolingual children continue to improve across the 3 ages, the bilingual children seem to flatten out. It seems that the effect of bilingualism here is just to move them ahead a little more quickly. They get to the same place as the other children, but they just get there a little faster. These studies have examined several of the components of reading. How do children develop the constituent abilities needed for literacy, for independent reading? What these studies have shown is that knowing the forms, knowledge of the letters, is not in itself sufficient for reading. Children need to come to understand these forms as symbols. We also saw that bilingual children were more advanced than the monolingual children on some of these tasks. In the cases where children's language experience pointed to contrasts and gave children 2 different ways of looking at things, it seemed that the bilingual experience was particularly helpful. It was also the case that biliterate children, those who were learning 2 different writing systems, were more advanced than all of the others, but not until the system had sorted itself out. There was an initial stage of confusion where these difficult rules could not be understood very well at all, and children made many errors in trying to apply these rules to our tasks. And finally, in the last study, we saw that bilingual children maintained an advantage in their ability to manipulate and segment sounds of words right through the early stages of learning to read. And as we've seen in past research, this ability to manipulate sounds is crucial for alphabetic reading. We can conclude several things from these studies that have general implications for the role that bilingualism plays in children's early experiences with literacy. First, we can see from the results of the moving word task and the word size task that knowledge of the forms is not sufficient. And we know that because we made sure children were proficient in these forms, and yet many of these children were unable to solve the tasks. This doesn't mean we want to stop making children practice the alphabet or stop drilling them on flashcards to identify letters. But rather, we have to understand that this is not in itself sufficient for literacy. It's only a beginning, and knowing the forms isn't enough to assure that the forms have the right kind of mental representation so that it can be useful for reading. In other words, the forms have to become symbols. This transfer of knowledge of objects to knowledge of symbols is a general process that we've seen across the children in these studies that has rather large implications for children at this stage. What's particularly important is that we saw that bilingualism in itself is important in promoting some aspects of this development. So this very important aspect of cognitive development, in which mental representations of forms develop into representations of symbols, is actually enhanced by the experience that comes with knowing and using two languages. The reason is probably because the two languages highlight the contrasts and highlight the important differences that children need to attend to. When the contrasts are made clear, children can see them and can see the general principle much more easily. And in fact, the final conclusion makes just this point. The greatest advantages are where the two languages present children with contrasting information, because in diversity, children can see the commonality and they can begin to understand the underlying rules of the system. All of these children in our studies are going to learn how to read, and they're probably going to learn how to read at about the same time. The advantage that bilingualism gives some of these children is that they understand the process earlier and most likely clearer.